Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well. I'd like to welcome you to our final module for the course, which is always crazy, especially when I teach this course in a 6 week section like you all. It seems to just go by really quickly. But just a couple of general things before I jump into content. I wanted to say that I've really enjoyed teaching you guys. It's been a fun class in the sense of so many diverse content areas and grade levels. You've done a really good job applying the content from our course to your actual classroom, particularly in that critical thinking application activity I had you do for our previous module, and we'll be doing something similar in terms of creative thinking this week. I love this portion of the class because we shift from some of the theory of differentiation into actual application. And again, I appreciate you guys speaking out and saying you wanted some more practice with application. So hopefully this critical thinking activity was good for you all. And this week with creative thinking, will give you yet another opportunity to really apply our content to your classroom. So a few things in terms of last week that I wanted to point out from our creative, or rather critical thinking application assignment. Um, Make sure that you take some time to read each other's work. I know that you already read at least two of your classmates' learning or lesson plans, but I would really encourage you to go back and read over them. You guys did a good job thinking through step by step what would this look like day to day. I was impressed to see several of you guys implement other content that we've talked about, such as your pre-assessment and lots of good differentiation strategies as well. So take a moment, go back and read each other's work. I do think in terms of gifted education, the best resource we have is each other, and to ask each other, how are you doing this and what can we learn from each other's work? So looking at your critical thinking application assignments, a lot of you, the majority of you looked into mind mapping, which is one of my favorite strategies. I was happy to see you guys apply that in different manners depending upon your content and your grade level. I also saw some work with the DeBono 6 thinking hats, which you'll see again in this week's work on creative thinking, as well as cubing. If I'm correct, those were the three main strategies that I saw. A couple of things from your lesson plans that I wanted to point out, just to give you some things to look for as you potentially go back and review each other's work. Um, let's see, Stephen did a lesson with mind mapping and looking at economics, and I was interested to see how he kind of brought mind mapping further than just saying we're going to do one mind map in one day. He actually talked about developing that into more of a project over several days, and asking his gifted students to bring in some more real world application. So I thought that was very effective. Carrie also used mind mapping, but more to help with a research based assignment, which is really good as well. Sometimes when we're doing these at times for our students unfamiliar projects, such as a heavy research paper, or perhaps a document analysis if you're still thinking about history. When we're starting to do that kind of analysis and critical thinking, like your DBQ, what does that stand for? Document based question. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jake. I know you're one of our history teachers. That's very unfamiliar for students at first. So doing some kind of critical thinking strategy, such as that mind mapping, is actually providing your scaffolding for your students to really dig deeper into that kind of critical thinking that's required for the assignment. I really enjoyed reading Sherelle's use of the mind map. She had a really creative way of connecting mind mapping to idea clustering. So one of the things with mind maps is you have to be really strategic about how you're using them. It can be dangerous to just do a mind map at first and then do nothing with it. So I really liked how she brought together, okay, we're doing a mind map as a group, and we're getting as many ideas as possible. When we talk about brainstorming this week and creative thinking, you'll see that when we're generating a lot of ideas, we don't want to say that any of them are not good. We just want to say as many ideas as possible. So she was discussing collecting ideas with this mind map and then clustering them and finding different similarities between them, particularly in the English classroom. So I liked her combination of mind mapping with idea clustering. Christy did a great job looking at differentiation, placing her students in small groups, not just for readiness, but also for interest. She had an interesting idea where students were cycling around in stations, which is really effective as well. Let's see, Brad had a great analysis of how to use the 6 thinking hats in his classroom. Was really impressed to see him apply that to his content area in terms of set design. So that was just kind of a fun application. Actually, the 6 thinking hats is pretty common in fine arts, particularly in acting. A fun fact about me is I'm actually very involved in improv comedy here in Charlotte. And we use the 6 thinking hats in our rehearsal all the time. So it's interesting to see the overlap between these different thinking strategies. Kayla had a good use of mind mapping in terms of a pre-assessment, which was a really effective way to start to understand where your students are and just have them write as many ideas as possible. Another one to look into, Reagan had a good example of using cubing. So I would encourage you guys to go back and look there. And I also want to talk about Victoria's work in terms of this idea of having an unsolved mystery. She had an interesting lesson plan there. But more so, Victoria did a good job talking about differentiating in terms of assessment. So she was talking through, I'll give my students a choice in terms of their product, and I'll also be differentiating that product depending upon readiness. So that's just, that's a fire hose of information. Just a couple of things that I noticed. You all did a wonderful job on that. Please do go back and look into your classmates' work. The more that you read in terms of application with these strategies, the easier it will get. So one note I did want to make in terms of these critical thinking strategies is particularly that section on taking things further. So one thing I did notice in that portion of your lesson plans is the majority of you listed, for lack of a better term, extensions that the gifted and talented students could complete. I saw a lot of language in the sense of, if the gifted and talented students finish early, then they can do X. If they have completed the assignment, then they can do this extension activity. So when we think back to differentiation and serving our gifted students, we want to be aware that we're not giving them extra, but we're giving them different. And this is something that's really hard. I still struggle with this a lot. Instead of wording this as, when you're finished with X, then do this next thing, I want to challenge you to think of, what can my students who are gifted and talented, what can they do from the start that is different? So a lot of times we have a concern, and several of you guys have brought this up. Well, what if the gifted and talented students are frustrated because they're doing something extra? How is that going to impact them? Will they be frustrated? When we frame it as, you're done, what now? Then that is kind of frustrating. It feels like, okay, well, why would I go ahead and get done? Because then I always have this, quote, extension activity. Particularly if that extension activity doesn't clearly connect to what the other students in the classroom are doing. So if we're saying we're doing an English language arts lesson, we've just done this really cool cubing activity, but you're saying the cubing activity is done, put away all your materials, now write an essay analyzing the theme. You see how those two things are just not connected? So it can seem very much, okay, I've done the work, now I got to do this extra thing. And when we think about differentiation in that manner, it just becomes extra, extension, and it doesn't really connect to what we're doing within the classroom. That's a lot of the temptation in serving gifted students, is we all do the same thing, then the gifted students do their extension. That can definitely produce some kind of negative feelings for our gifted students. So, what I want to challenge you to do, particularly in this week when we look at creative thinking, is change your mindset from extension to different. So, what can your gifted students do differently within the same materials and the same activity that will challenge them? And that's the reason why I wanted to bring up Victoria's. She did a good job talking about we're going to have these different choices, different products, depending upon our readiness level that the students will do. That way, it doesn't feel like you do X activity and then we go off to something else. So I just want to give you a couple of ideas based on your three most common strategies that I saw you guys using. First off, cubing. Okay, so one easy way to change cubing depending upon readiness or interest is to make different cubes for your different groups, right? So rather than saying all of our students are going to finish the same cubing questions, then our gifted students have this extra essay to write or extra project to do. You could change the actual content of the questions on the cube itself. So rather than simply comparing and contrasting by making a Venn diagram, they're taking that one step further. And when they're creating their Venn diagram, they're bringing in original sources that would support the comparisons and the differences as well. I've also seen one side of the cube for more the gifted and talented students be to create their own cube. So then they are thinking of their own analysis questions. Rather than just saying we're all doing this cube at once, then my gifted students are doing something different. There's a lot you can do with mind mapping as well in terms of taking it further, but within your strategy. One method that I really love, and several of you guys kind of got there with this, you mentioned using a mind map for pre-assessment. But one thing that I love to do is a mind map for pre-assessment, and then as we learn the material and as we're getting ready for the formal post-assessment, I have my students take their original mind map and start looking at, okay, this is what I originally thought. These are my original understandings. It's as simple as saying use a different colored pencil or marker, and they write how their understandings have changed from their pre-assessment to now their more advanced understanding. So we're still using that mind map, but see how we're going deeper? That's very metacognitive. They're thinking about their thinking. What is it that I used to think? Now this is how it's changed. Another good thing to do with mind mapping in terms of taking it further is to have the students cycle to each other's mind maps. Some of you did that in terms of stationing, but I love to do that with my students because then I ask them, why do you think your classmate put these ideas together? What is the similarity that they found that these ideas needed to go together in the mind map itself? Even if you were to have your students take each other's mind maps and then give primary sources to support the connections that they made. If you think about your own assignment that I had you do, I did not require you to use sources for your actual lesson plan. But what I did require you to do in terms of sources is your analysis of each other's lesson plans. So I could have just said, all right, review each other's lesson plans and say what you think, right? Which is kind of what I did. But by giving that extra layer of use the sources that we have covered to support why you think this was a good strategy. You see how I brought that deeper in terms of critical thinking? So if you are working with students who are gifted and talented, have them switch mind maps and then analyze each other's. Can you find resources from class that support why your students made these connections? Maybe you say, can you find resources that contradict why they made these connections? So that's a good way to bring this further, but within the concept of mind mapping. Another fun thing to do is to kind of switch the mind map, and I've done this with note cards. I'll just give my students a huge stack of note cards with all of the really important concepts or terms that they need to know. And then I have them organize them in terms of relationships. So here's all your note cards. Make a pile of maybe themes and a pile of maybe characters. But you'll quickly notice that students make different piles. So I'll have the students cycle around and say, why did they put these concepts together? And they're looking for what are those relationships. Sometimes I have them look at what are these relationships based on De Bono's 6 thinking hats. So you see the difference here? I'm not saying you're done with the mind mapping, write your own story. I'm saying, okay, within this one strategy that we're looking at, let's take this deeper. Let's take this further. A good example that we had, I want to give the right credit. One of you used the 6 thinking hats. I want to say it was in an English classroom. And one of your extensions was to use the green thinking hat, which is more imaginative, to think of a new ending to a story. That is a great extension because we're still within this concept of the thinking hats. Now we're taking that a step further. So I thought that was a really great example too. So it just comes with practice. When you're thinking about those extensions, try to think of the extensions related to the actual lesson that you've been teaching, using the same strategy but bringing it deeper, rather than finishing one activity and then the students are done twiddling their thumbs, then saying, now it's your turn to do something new. So you'll see the more that you look over each other's work here, critical thinking strategies, they are super flexible, which is why I like them. You can easily use the 6 thinking hats along with the mind mapping, along with cubing. And of course, there were others in your Blackboard library, but I wanted to focus my conversation on the 3 common ones that I saw. So critical thinking was last module. In this module, we will focus on creative thinking. So this final module is very similar to the previous one on creative thinking. I'm actually having you do the same assignment in terms of applying a creative thinking strategy to your classroom rather than a critical thinking strategy to your classroom. So it's the same exact assignment. Before you start looking into your library content, think about another content or lesson or unit that you've taught that you want to bring in some differentiation for. Keep that in mind and then start really investigating these creative thinking assignments. Think about a lesson plan and write up how you could use this creative thinking assignment in order to serve your gifted students. The biggest challenge this week is that extension. So try to think of that extension to be more related to the content itself, more related to the creative thinking strategy that you are using. So just like last week, I'll have you post your lesson plan to that discussion board by Saturday at noon, and then respond to at least 2 of your classmates, again using your sources, by Sunday evening. If you've taken 594 with me, I know Dr. Slade does it differently, but I actually teach a whole module on creative thinking and what creativity really is. So I do want to talk just for a couple minutes about what creative thinking is, because there tends to be a lot of misconception, not only on the student's part, but also on the teacher's part here. So the biggest problem with teaching creative thinking is the conception here. We often think that creative thinking is extra, and especially on the student's perspective, it seems very elementary. We equate creative thinking with out-of-the-box thinking and crazy thinking. And so especially our gifted students, the older they get, they start to think of it as kind of unnecessary and definitely as a time filler. But if we look into creativity, I do want to give you a quick definition because I think it's important that we have something to go from here. There are so many definitions of creativity. I like to just give a standard definition. And the standard definition basically has two components in order for a product to be creative. And those two components are that the product is original or new, but it's also useful. And that's kind of the part that gets forgotten. A lot of times we think of creativity as just new craziness, but we want to also challenge our students that creativity needs to have a purpose. Now, there's a lot of debate about what that purpose could be. It could be a very personal purpose in terms of expression, but also the creative purpose could be I'm making this new crazy invention, but it also actually does something. So there's something important to it. The example that I always give in terms of showing the importance of both creativity being original and useful, something can be original, like if a child or an adult makes their own language, right? So their own language is goopity goppity boop. That's definitely original, but is it actually useful? Like, can we do anything with it? And if we think about just originality, that's where students get caught. They think it just has to be crazy, but then there's not really purpose in it. So particularly with our gifted students, we want them to see that creativity is not just crazy new ideas, they're also new and useful ideas. And that helps them see that creativity is not just extra, but it's also quite necessary in the classroom. So this week, you are looking at various creative teaching strategies. You will see some repeats in terms of critical thinking. The two go hand in hand. The main thing with creative thinking is that we want to give ourselves lots of new ideas. So when we think about, I'm going to draw this real quick for you guys. When we think about creative thinking, we have both convergent and divergent thinking. So a convergent idea, if we're engaging in convergent thinking, that means we're getting smaller. And divergent thinking means that we're getting bigger. So, see if you can see this. Yeah, it really looks like we're starting with convergent thinking or divergent. Here, you've got a lot of ideas. You're trying to make them practical and useful, but then you want to think of a lot of new crazy ideas, so we get divergent again. But then to get back to that practicality, we go back to convergent. Then we need some new ideas, so we go back to divergent. Then back to convergent. So with creative thinking, it goes both ways. We think of a lot of new ideas. Those are a lot of the strategies that we see in the classroom. But then you have to take that next step to what can you do with these creative ideas. A lot of your strategies this week are focused on divergent thinking, which literally is just thinking that goes off in a lot of different directions. Brainstorming is very divergent. Attribute listing, which you'll see, is very divergent. So you're trying to get as many ideas as possible. As you go through these, I would really encourage you to think, how can I actually use this material in my classroom and have my students think of multiple ideas? One little quick note, in terms of creative thinking, I have definitely had some experience combating students' misconception about why creativity is important. So just one really good example here. One of my favorite strategies is called Scamper, and I would bet that some of you have already heard of Scamper. I would be surprised if none of you had. But as you'll see, Scamper it's an acronym that helps with ideation. So the S is for substitute. We think about the C being compare, contrast. Basically, you're trying to use that attribute, or that acronym rather, to get as many new ideas as possible. What I have done with Scamper and students who are highly gifted is, first, I give them, like in a science classroom, I'll give them an original article, something that's very primary source, in their sense, very important and real. particularly maybe like an invention that saved lives. And I'll have them look into this invention and look at how did this idea come to be. And I kind of teach them to look for those Scamper attributes through this real world example. And then I give them a very elementary example of like, here's a bag filled with random materials. What can you make out of it? And I have them use the Scamper acronym again and see how the same creative thinking is used in this quote elementary idea where the students are making something out of trash, and how they created this new life-changing invention. Um, so really helping your students see the connection between here's my creative thinking strategy. I can use it in a very basic way. I can also use it in a very mature, more advanced way within the specific content. So as you're looking at creative thinking this week, I would encourage you to think about how to help your students buy into the importance of creative thinking, the importance of divergent thinking, lots of ideas, but also that convergent thinking. How can I narrow down those ideas to make them into something that is useful? So this week, just to clarify, you have your creative thinking assignment due Saturday at noon, and then your responses to each other's posts by Sunday evening. One final activity you do have for this week, considering it is our last module, I did set up a final discussion board post and just titled it, What Next? This is a very chill assignment. You are not required to cite any sources here. What I want from you is your honesty. So by Saturday at noon, I want you to respond to those 5 questions that are posted in that discussion board thread, asking you what can you apply from this content to your own classroom, what are some of the challenges that you face, and what are your next steps. Within that, I've also asked you to do 2 things. First is, and this is totally optional, but I would encourage you guys to share some contact information with each other in terms of emails. You guys have been a great class, and I've been encouraged to see you guys interacting with each other. So I think it would be effective for you, especially like within similar content areas, to potentially share your email so you can keep in touch. And also I've asked you to give me some course feedback. This is a short class, it's very condensed. I am always looking for ways to improve this class, so please answer that honestly. If there's anything practical that you think I could do to make this course more effective, I really want to know. So just for clarity, we're doing our creative thinking assignment, original lesson plan on Saturday at noon, and those responses on Sunday evening. And then your initial post to that discussion board by Saturday at noon, and your responses to your classmates Sunday evening as well. Again, you don't need sources there. I just want to hear your honest opinions. Okay, well, as always, I have gone way over. Particularly with creative thinking, it's hard to make myself stop talking. So if this is an area of interest for you guys, I would encourage you to reach out to me. Creative thinking is one of the concepts that I work really heavily in, so I'd be glad to give you more strategies. Otherwise, I hope that you guys have a wonderful week. Please continue to contact me if you have any questions, and thanks again.